The old wooden box cracked open with a sharp sound that echoed through the silent church. Gasps spread across the room like wildfire. Inside the box were yellowed documents, a faded photograph, and a small silver necklace shaped like a broken heart. The necklace fell onto the wooden floor with a soft clink. Everyone in the church stared in disbelief. Pastor Elijah Brooks, a respected man who had led the community for over 25 years, suddenly staggered backward. His face turned pale and sweat formed on his forehead. Across the room, an elderly woman named Mama Ruth clutched her chest. "No," she whispered, "it cannot be." The young woman standing beside the box slowly picked up the photograph. Her hands trembled. "Then explain this," she said, her voice shaking but loud enough for everyone to hear. The entire church leaned forward. Because the photograph showed something impossible. A baby wrapped in cloth. And standing beside the baby were two people everyone in town recognized. Pastor Elijah Brooks and Mama Ruth. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was the date written behind the photo. 42 years ago. And the name written under the baby. The same name as the young woman holding the photo. Silence swallowed the room. The young woman lifted her head slowly, tears filling her eyes. "Why did you lie to me my whole life?" she asked. Pastor Elijah opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Mama Ruth began to cry quietly. People in the church started whispering. "What does this mean? Whose child was that? Why hide something like this for 40 years? The young woman clenched the necklace tightly in her hand. "You told me my parents died in a car accident," she said. "You said there was no family left." Her voice cracked. "But this says something very different." The crowd looked back and forth between Pastor Elijah and Mama Ruth. Both of them looked like people carrying a heavy secret that had finally broken open. The young woman took a step forward. "Tell them," she said firmly. Pastor Elijah shook his head slowly. "Not here," he whispered. But it was already too late. Because everyone in the church wanted answers. And deep down, many of them already suspected that the truth would destroy everything they believed about the two most respected people in their town. The young woman looked at the photo again. Then she turned it toward the crowd. "This baby is me," she said. A wave of shock ran through the room. "And these two people," she continued slowly, pointing at the photograph, "they are the ones who tried to hide the truth." Pastor Elijah suddenly shouted, "Stop." But the damage had already been done. The young woman raised the necklace high in the air. "This was hidden inside the box with the photo," she said. "And I want to know why." Mama Ruth began shaking her head frantically. "You don't understand," she cried. "You were never supposed to find that box." The room exploded with murmurs. Pastor Elijah lowered his head. And then he said something that made the entire church freeze. "If she knows the truth," he said quietly, "then the whole town will suffer for it." The young woman stared at him in disbelief. What does that even mean? But Pastor Elijah refused to say another word. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. A storm was coming. And it felt as though the storm had been waiting 42 years to arrive. The young woman looked around the church. Faces she had known her whole life. Neighbors. Friends. People who had watched her grow up. All of them now looked at her like a stranger. She slowly placed the photograph back into the broken box. But before closing it, she noticed something else hidden underneath the papers. Another envelope. Older. Darker. Sealed with red wax. Her heart began to pound. Because written on the front of the envelope were 7 terrifying words. "Do not open until the truth, RETURNS." Her hands froze. Pastor Elijah suddenly rushed forward. "Don't open that." But the young woman had already broken the seal. And the moment she unfolded the paper inside, her eyes widened in horror. Because the letter revealed something far worse than anyone in that church could imagine. something that meant the secret they had tried to hide for years was only the beginning. And if the letter was true, someone in that very room had committed a terrible crime 42 years ago. A crime everyone believed had never happened. The young woman slowly lifted her head. Her voice trembled as she spoke the name written in the letter. And when the crowd heard that name, the entire church erupted into chaos. But the real story, the one that started everything, began 42 years earlier. 42 years earlier, the town of Red Creek was quiet, peaceful, and deeply connected. Everyone knew everyone. Children ran through dusty streets after school, neighbors shared food during the weekends, and every Sunday morning, the church bell echoed across the town like a call home. But beneath the peaceful surface of Red Creek, a secret had already begun to grow. At the center of it, all were two young people, Elijah Brooks and Ruth Walker. Back then, Elijah was not a pastor. He was simply a hardworking young man in his early 20s, known for helping anyone who needed it. He fixed roofs, repaired fences, and often helped elderly neighbors carry groceries. People trusted him. Ruth Walker was different. She was strong, proud, and sharp-minded. She worked at the town clinic as a nurse assistant and dreamed of one day becoming a full nurse. Many young men admired Ruth, but she kept her distance from most of them. Except Elijah. The two had grown up in the same neighborhood. Their families attended the same church, and for years they had been inseparable friends. But everyone in town could see something more growing between them. Except they never spoke about it. Because life in Red Creek was simple but strict. Reputation meant everything. And people watched closely. One evening, after a long day at the clinic, Ruth walked down the quiet road leading home. The sky was turning orange as the sun slowly disappeared behind the trees. Elijah was sitting on the wooden fence outside his house. He waved when he saw her. "You look tired," he said. Ruth sighed and leaned against the fence beside him. "Long day," she replied. 3 patients came in with fever, and the doctor didn't even show up until noon." Elijah shook his head. "That clinic needs more help." Ruth smiled faintly. "That's why I'm studying every night. One day I'll be running that place." Elijah laughed. "I believe it." For a moment they sat quietly, watching the sun set. Then Ruth spoke again. "Elijah, have you ever felt like something big is coming?" Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "I don't know," she said slowly. "Just a feeling." Before Elijah could answer, a loud truck roared down the road. Dust flew into the air. Inside the truck sat Marcus Hale. And everyone in Red Creek knew Marcus Hale. His family owned the largest land in the area. They were wealthy, powerful, and used to getting whatever they wanted. Marcus leaned out the truck window as he passed. "Well, look at that," he said with a smirk. "The town's favorite nurse and favorite handyman." Ruth's face tightened. She did not like Marcus. Not many people did. But most stayed quiet because of his family's influence. Marcus slowed the truck and stared at Ruth. "You still working at that little clinic?" he asked. Ruth folded her arms. "Yes." Marcus smiled. "You deserve better than that place." Elijah stepped forward slightly. "She's doing just fine," he said calmly. Marcus laughed and drove off. But his eyes lingered on Ruth until the truck disappeared around the corner. Ruth shook her head. "That man gives me a bad feeling." Elijah nodded. "You're not the only one." That night, the town slept peacefully. But something had already begun, moving quietly behind the scenes. A few weeks later, Ruth noticed something strange. She felt tired all the time. Her hands trembled sometimes. At first, she thought it was stress from work. But then the morning sickness started. And deep down, she knew what it meant. She sat alone inside the small clinic bathroom, staring at the mirror. Her heart pounded. Because there was only one possibility. She was pregnant. And the father was Elijah. Fear rushed through her mind. In a small town like Red Creek, news like that could destroy reputations overnight. Especially for someone like Ruth, who worked in healthcare. And Elijah, who was known by everyone as a man of strong morals. That evening, she walked slowly to Elijah's house. He was fixing a wooden chair outside. When he saw her face, he immediately knew something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked. Ruth hesitated. Then she whispered the words that changed everything. "Elijah, I'm pregnant." The hammer fell from Elijah's hand. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he stepped closer. "Are you sure?" Ruth nodded. "Yes." Elijah ran his hands through his hair. His mind raced. "We'll figure it out," he said finally. But Ruth wasn't convinced. "You don't understand," she said softly. "If people find out before we're married, my job could be gone." Elijah looked determined. "Then we get married." Ruth blinked. "What?" "We get married," Elijah repeated. "Simple." But life in Red Creek was never that simple. Because 3 days later, something happened that changed the direction of their lives forever. Late at night, Ruth heard a knock on her door. When she opened it, Marcus Hale stood outside. His smile was strange, almost threatening. "I heard some interesting news," he said slowly. Ruth's heart dropped. How could he know, she thought. Marcus leaned closer. "You should be careful, Ruth," he whispered. "Secrets have a way of spreading." Then he handed her something. A small silver necklace shaped like a broken heart. Ruth stared at it in confusion. "What is this?" Marcus smiled. "A reminder." Before she could ask more questions, he walked away into the darkness. Ruth stood frozen at the doorway, her hands shaking. Because somehow, Marcus Hale already knew about the baby. And if he knew, the entire town might soon know too. But what Ruth didn't realize was that Marcus knew far more than just her secret. He knew something that would change the lives of everyone in Red Creek. And the baby she was carrying would soon become the center of a secret that people would try to bury for decades. Before the story continues, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And if you enjoy stories full of suspense and shocking secrets like this one, make sure you subscribe to the channel and like the video so you don't miss the next chapter. But here's something to think about. If someone powerful discovered your deepest secret, what would you do to protect yourself? Marcus Hale did not sleep much that night. He sat on the porch of his large family house, slowly rocking in a wooden chair while the crickets sang in the dark fields around Red Creek. In his hand was a glass of whiskey, but he barely drank it. His mind was busy. Very busy. Inside the house, his father, Henry Hale, was already asleep. The Hale family had owned most of the farmland around Red Creek for decades. Their name carried weight, power, and sometimes fear. Marcus had grown up learning one simple truth from his father. Control the town, or the town will control you. And right now, Marcus had discovered something interesting. A secret. Ruth Walker's secret. He smiled slightly as he thought about the look on her face when he gave her the necklace. Fear. That was the look he enjoyed seeing most. Because fear made people easy to control. Across town, Ruth sat in her small bedroom staring at the silver necklace lying on the table. The broken heart symbol made her uneasy. Why would Marcus give her something like that? What did it mean? Her mind kept returning to the same terrifying question. How did Marcus know she was pregnant? She had told no one except Elijah. And Elijah would never tell anyone. Or at least, she believed he wouldn't. Ruth shook the thought away immediately. Elijah had always been honest with her. He was not the kind of man who spread secrets. Still, something about the situation did not feel right. The next morning, the town woke to another peaceful day. Children walked to school. Farmers headed into the fields. And Elijah arrived early at the church to repair a broken bench in the back hall. Pastor Daniel Carter, the church leader at the time, greeted him warmly. "You always come when we need help," Pastor Daniel said. Elijah smiled modestly. "Just doing my part." The pastor nodded. "You have a good heart, son." But as Elijah worked, his thoughts kept drifting back to Ruth and the baby. He meant what he said the night before. He was ready to marry her, ready to face whatever gossip or trouble came their way. But before he could even begin planning their future, trouble had already begun spreading through town. Around midday, Elijah stopped by the small grocery store owned by Mrs. Johnson. The moment he stepped inside, the quiet whispers began. Two women standing near the counter suddenly stopped talking. Mrs. Johnson gave him a strange look. Elijah frowned slightly. Something was wrong. As he walked through the store, he noticed more people staring. Then he heard a whisper. "That's him." Another voice replied quietly. "The father." Elijah froze. His stomach dropped. The news had spread. But how? He quickly left the store and hurried toward Ruth's house. Meanwhile, Ruth was at the clinic, trying to focus on her work, but the patients kept looking at her strangely. One older woman even shook her head in disappointment. Finally, Ruth could not take it anymore. She stepped outside the clinic to breathe. That was when she saw Elijah running toward her. "Elijah," she said nervously. "People know," he said immediately. Ruth's face turned pale. "It's already spreading through town." Ruth covered her mouth. How is that possible?" But deep down, they both knew the answer. Marcus Hale. Just then, a loud truck engine roared nearby. Marcus's truck rolled slowly down the street. He stopped directly in front of the clinic. People nearby paused to watch. Marcus stepped out of the truck casually. He looked around at the gathering townspeople, enjoying the attention. Then he spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. Well, looks like Red Creek is getting some exciting news these days." Ruth's hands trembled. Marcus continued. "A baby coming into the world without a wedding ring first." Gasps spread through the small crowd. Elijah stepped forward, anger burning in his eyes. "Leave her alone, Marcus." Marcus raised his hands with a fake smile. "I'm just sharing what everyone's already talking about." Then he leaned closer to Elijah and whispered something only Elijah could hear. "If you think that secret is bad, wait until people learn the rest." Elijah's face changed instantly. "What rest?" he demanded. Marcus stepped back, laughing. "You'll find out soon enough." He climbed back into his truck and drove away. The crowd slowly began whispering again. Ruth felt tears burning in her eyes. "This town will destroy me," she whispered. Elijah gently held her shoulders. "No," he said firmly, "we'll fix this." But at that exact moment, someone unexpected stepped out of the crowd. Pastor Daniel Carter, the respected leader of the church. He looked at Elijah with disappointment. "Elijah, is it true?" Elijah hesitated. Then he nodded. "Yes." The pastor sighed heavily. "You should have come to me first." Before Elijah could respond, Pastor Daniel turned to Ruth. "And you, working in the clinic while hiding something like this?" Ruth felt her chest tighten. "I was going to explain." But the pastor interrupted. "This is not just about the two of you." He looked around at the crowd. "Our town values responsibility and honesty." Elijah felt anger rising again. "We are being responsible," he said. "We plan to marry." That caused another wave of whispers. But Pastor Daniel did not look relieved. Instead, he looked troubled. Because he knew something Elijah and Ruth did not know yet. Marcus Hale had already visited him earlier that morning. And what Marcus told him was far more disturbing than a simple pregnancy. The pastor slowly spoke again. "Elijah, there is something you must know." But before he could continue, a loud scream suddenly came from the road. Everyone turned. A young boy was running toward them in panic. "Someone help," the boy shouted. "There's been an accident." The crowd rushed toward the road. A car had crashed into a tree just outside town. Smoke rose from the front of the vehicle. People ran forward to help. Elijah pushed through the crowd. Then his heart nearly stopped. Because the car belonged to someone he recognized. Marcus Hale. And inside the wrecked car, there was a small metal box sitting on the passenger seat. The same kind of box that, many years later, would appear inside the church. But no one knew yet that the contents of that box would become the center of a secret powerful enough to haunt Red Creek for more than 4 decades. Smoke curled into the afternoon sky as people gathered around the crashed car. The front of Marcus Hale's truck had slammed into a large oak tree just outside the edge of Red Creek. The metal hood was crushed, and the windshield had shattered across the road. Elijah pushed through the crowd. "Move back," he said firmly. "Give him air." Marcus was slumped behind the steering wheel, blood running down the side of his forehead. His eyes were half open, barely conscious. Ruth arrived moments later, still wearing her clinic coat. She immediately switched into medical mode. "Someone bring water," she shouted. 2 men helped pull Marcus out of the truck carefully and laid him on the grass beside the road. The small metal box on the passenger seat slid down and landed on the floor of the truck. Most people didn't notice it, but Elijah did. He leaned inside the damaged truck and picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. The surface of the box was scratched and worn, like it had been kept for years. Elijah frowned. "What is this?" he muttered. Before he could open it, Ruth's voice called out. "Elijah, I need help." He quickly set the box on the ground and rushed over. Marcus groaned weakly. "Don't move too much," Ruth told him while checking his pulse. "You're lucky," she added. "That crash could have killed you." Marcus slowly opened his eyes. For a moment, he looked confused. Then he noticed the crowd around him. And suddenly, he began to panic. "The box," Marcus shouted weakly. "Where is the box?" People looked at each other in confusion. Elijah slowly walked back toward the truck and picked up the metal box again. "This one?" he asked. Marcus's eyes widened. "Yes, that one." Elijah studied Marcus carefully. "What's inside?" Marcus's breathing grew heavier. "None of your business." That answer only made Elijah more curious. Around them, the townspeople whispered quietly. Ruth glanced at Elijah. "Just give it back," she said softly. "He needs medical attention." But Marcus suddenly grabbed Elijah's arm with surprising strength. "Listen to me," Marcus whispered urgently. "You don't want to open that box." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" Marcus looked around nervously. Because now, several people were watching closely. "If that box opens," Marcus said quietly, "some people in this town will wish they had never been born." Elijah stared at him. "Is that supposed to scare me?" Marcus said nothing. Instead, he slowly released Elijah's arm and leaned back against the tree, breathing heavily. Ruth spoke firmly. "He needs to go to the clinic now." 2 men helped lift Marcus into another vehicle. As they drove him toward town, Elijah remained standing by the crashed truck, still holding the metal box. He turned it over in his hands. There was a small lock on the front, but the lock was broken, meaning the box could be opened easily. Elijah looked around. Most of the crowd had already followed Marcus back toward town. Only a few people remained near the accident scene. His curiosity burned stronger. Just as he began lifting the lid, "Elijah." The voice startled him. Pastor Daniel Carter was walking toward him quickly. "Don't open that," the pastor said immediately. Elijah paused. "Why not?" The pastor looked uneasy. "That box belongs to Marcus. It's not your place to open it." Elijah studied the pastor carefully. "You know what's inside." Pastor Daniel hesitated. For a moment, he seemed ready to speak. Then he shook his head. No. But something about his face told Elijah that he was not telling the full truth. Elijah closed the box again. Fine, he said, then I'll bring it to the clinic. The pastor nodded quickly. Yes, that would be best. But as Elijah walked toward town carrying the box, he couldn't shake the feeling that everyone around him was hiding something. And somehow, that small metal box was connected to it. Meanwhile, at the clinic, Marcus lay on a hospital bed while Ruth cleaned the wound on his forehead. You're lucky it wasn't worse, she said. Marcus stared at the ceiling. You care too much about people who don't deserve it. Ruth ignored the comment. After a moment, Marcus turned his head slightly. Did Elijah open the box? Ruth stopped. No. Marcus relaxed slightly. Good. But Ruth looked at him carefully. What's inside that box, Marcus? Marcus smiled faintly. History. Ruth frowned. What kind of history? Marcus looked directly at her. The kind that destroys families. Before Ruth could ask another question, Elijah walked into the clinic holding the box. Marcus immediately sat up slightly. You brought it. Elijah placed the box on a small table beside the bed. Relax, I didn't open it. Marcus let out a breath. But Elijah continued. Yet. Marcus looked at him sharply. You don't understand what you're messing with. Elijah crossed his arms. Then explain it. Marcus stayed silent. The tension inside the clinic grew heavy. Finally, Marcus spoke again. You really want to know the truth? Elijah nodded. Marcus pointed at Ruth. Then ask her. Both Elijah and Ruth froze. What does that mean? Elijah asked. Marcus smiled again. Ask her about the night she stayed late at the clinic 3 months ago. Ruth's face suddenly went pale. Elijah, don't listen to him, she said quickly. But Marcus continued. That night changed everything. Elijah turned slowly toward Ruth. What is he talking about? Ruth struggled to speak. But before she could answer, someone outside the clinic suddenly shouted. There's a fire. People began running down the street. Smoke rose from the direction of the church. Elijah rushed to the window. His eyes widened. The church building was burning. Flames climbed into the sky. And deep inside the burning church, there was something hidden that no one in Red Creek was supposed to ever find. Before the story continues, take a moment to think about something. If you discovered a secret powerful enough to destroy an entire town, would you reveal it or keep it hidden? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you're enjoying this story so far, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves suspenseful stories like this. Because the truth behind the secret in Red Creek is only beginning to unfold. The fire spread faster than anyone expected. Bright orange flames climbed the wooden walls of the church, swallowing the roof piece by piece. Thick smoke poured into the sky as townspeople ran toward the building in panic. Elijah, someone shouted, we need help. Without thinking twice, Elijah rushed out of the clinic and sprinted toward the church. Ruth followed close behind. By the time they arrived, dozens of people had gathered outside. Some carried buckets of water, others simply stood frozen in shock. The church had been standing for nearly 50 years. It was the heart of Red Creek. And now it was burning. What happened? Elijah asked as he grabbed a bucket. No one knows, Mrs. Johnson said nervously. One moment everything was normal, and the next moment smoke started pouring from the back room. Elijah's stomach tightened. The back room. That was where the church kept old records, donations, and important documents from decades earlier. He rushed toward the door, but 2 men held him back. You can't go in there, one of them shouted. The roof could collapse any second. But Elijah kept staring at the flames. Something deep inside him told him that whatever was burning inside that room mattered. A lot. Across the crowd, Pastor Daniel Carter stood silently watching the fire. His face looked pale, almost frightened. Ruth noticed him and quickly walked over. "Pastor," she said, breathing heavily, "do you know what started the fire?" Pastor Daniel shook his head slowly. I don't know." But his eyes were locked on the burning building, as if he was watching something very important disappear. Minutes passed. The fire continued, destroying everything inside. Eventually, the town's small volunteer fire team arrived with equipment and began fighting the flames properly. Water sprayed across the building as smoke filled the air. But the damage was already severe. Half of the roof had collapsed. The back room was completely destroyed. And inside the clinic, Marcus Hale watched everything through the window. A slow smile appeared on his face. "Perfect," he muttered. One of the clinic assistants looked at him strangely. "What?" Marcus simply leaned back on the bed. "Nothing." Back at the church, Elijah stood beside Ruth watching the firefighters work. Something still bothered him. The timing of the fire felt strange. Too strain. Just hours earlier, Marcus had been talking about secrets. And now the one place that stored the town's old history was burning. Ruth suddenly grabbed Elijah's arm. "Elijah, look." He followed her gaze. Pastor Daniel was walking away from the crowd quietly. Toward the side of the church. Toward the back. "Elijah," Ruth whispered, "why would he go there right now?" Elijah narrowed his eyes. "Let's find out." They carefully moved through the crowd and followed the pastor around the side of the building. The fire was mostly in the front now, and the back area was filled with smoke but not flames. Pastor Daniel knelt near the back wall of the church. He began digging under a loose wooden panel near the ground. Ruth gasped quietly. "What is he doing?" Elijah stepped forward. "Pastor." Pastor Daniel froze. Slowly, he turned around. His face looked like someone who had just been caught doing something very wrong. "Elijah," he said nervously, "I can explain." Elijah pointed at the ground. "Explain what?" Pastor Daniel sighed deeply. Then he reached into the hole he had just opened and pulled out a small cloth bag. Elijah frowned. "What's that?" The pastor hesitated. But before he could answer, a loud voice shouted from the road. "Look what I found." Everyone turned. One of the firefighters was holding something he had pulled from the burning back room. It was blackened and covered in ash. But it was still recognizable. A metal lockbox. Elijah's heart skipped, because it looked almost identical to the one Marcus had earlier. The firefighter carried it toward the crowd. "What is it?" someone asked. "Looks like old church records," another person said. Pastor Daniel suddenly rushed forward. "Give me that," he said quickly. But the firefighter hesitated. "Shouldn't we check what's inside first?" The pastor's voice became firm. "Those are church documents." But the firefighter had already opened the lid. Inside were several burned papers. Most of them were unreadable. But one document remained mostly intact. The firefighter lifted it carefully. People gathered closer to see. "What does it say?" Mrs. Johnson asked. The firefighter squinted. "It looks like a birth record." The crowd murmured. Elijah felt a strange chill run down his spine. "Whose birth record?" someone asked. The firefighter looked again. Then his eyes widened. "Well, that's strange." "What?" the crowd asked. The firefighter slowly read the name written on the document. "Elijah Brooks." Silence fell across the crowd. Elijah stared in disbelief. "My birth record." But the firefighter wasn't finished. He read the next line. "Mother, Ruth Walker." Gasps exploded through the crowd. Ruth's face turned completely white. That can't be right," she whispered. Elijah shook his head. That's impossible. But the firefighter continued reading. Father, unknown. The crowd erupted into loud whispers. Elijah and Ruth are the same age. How could she be his mother? This makes no sense. Elijah's mind raced. Something was terribly wrong. Pastor Daniel looked like he was about to collapse. And across town, inside the clinic, Marcus Hale began laughing quietly to himself. Because the secret he had been waiting years to reveal had finally begun to surface. And the truth behind it was far darker than anyone in Red Creek could imagine. The crowd outside the burned church stood frozen. No one spoke for several long seconds. The firefighter still held the half-burned document in his hands, while everyone stared at Elijah and Ruth. It must be a mistake, someone finally said. Yes, another voice agreed quickly. Those papers were burned, the names could be wrong. But the whispers didn't stop. They only grew louder. Ruth stood like a statue. Her breathing was shallow, and her hands trembled slightly. Elijah looked just as confused. That record cannot be right, he said firmly. My parents died when I was a child. Everyone knows that. Mrs. Johnson nodded immediately. Yes, we all remember the accident. Pastor Daniel stepped forward slowly, his voice shaking. The fire destroyed many records. The document could be damaged. We should not jump to conclusions. But his words didn't calm the crowd. Instead, they raised more questions. Elijah looked directly at the pastor. You knew something, he said quietly. Pastor Daniel avoided his eyes. No, I didn't. But Ruth suddenly spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Pastor, tell the truth. Everyone turned toward her. Tears were forming in her eyes. You've worked in this church for years, she continued. You know every record stored here. The pastor said nothing. Ruth took a slow step forward. Did you know about that birth record? The pastor swallowed hard. I never saw that specific document. But Elijah's expression grew more serious. That's not what I asked, he said. The tension in the air became thick. Finally, Pastor Daniel sighed deeply. There are things in this town that people believed were better left buried. The crowd leaned closer. What things? Someone asked. But before the pastor could answer, a truck engine roared loudly from the road. Everyone turned. Marcus Hale's truck had returned. He stepped out slowly, his head wrapped with a small bandage from the crash earlier. Yet somehow, he looked perfectly fine. Almost pleased. Well, Marcus said loudly, walking toward the crowd. Looks like the truth is finally waking up. Elijah's jaw tightened. You did this, he said. Marcus shrugged. I only shared what already existed. The firefighter still held the document. Marcus pointed toward it. Go ahead, he said. Read the rest. The firefighter hesitated, but looked down again. There's another line here, he said slowly. Read it, Marcus insisted. The firefighter cleared his throat. Recorded at Red Creek Clinic, 42 years ago. Ruth's knees almost gave out. Because that was the same clinic where she now worked. Marcus smiled as he watched the shock spread across the crowd. Interesting, isn't it? He said. Elijah stepped closer to him. What are you trying to prove? Marcus leaned in slightly. That secrets always come back. Elijah clenched his fists. You're playing games with people's lives. Marcus's smile faded slightly. No, he said quietly. I'm correcting history. At that moment, Pastor Daniel spoke again. That's enough, Marcus. The entire crowd turned toward him. The pastor looked exhausted. Like someone who had carried a heavy burden for too long. You're not telling the whole story, the pastor said. Marcus laughed softly. Oh, I plan to. Then he turned to the crowd. You all want to know why that birth record exists. Several people nodded nervously. Marcus pointed directly at Ruth. Ask Ask her what happened the night she worked late at the clinic 42 years ago. Ruth shook her head immediately. No. Her voice was filled with fear. Don't do this. Marcus spread his arms. Why not? Everyone deserves the truth. Elijah looked between them, confused and frustrated. What night? He demanded. Marcus took another step forward. The night a baby was born in that clinic, when no one else was supposed to know. Gasps spread through the crowd again. But Pastor Daniel raised his hand suddenly. Stop. His voice echoed through the quiet street. Everyone turned toward him. The pastor's face looked pale but determined. If this truth comes out the wrong way, he said slowly, it will destroy this town. Marcus tilted his head. Maybe it deserves to be destroyed. The crowd began murmuring again. Elijah stepped forward once more. I want answers. He looked at Ruth. Did something happen at that clinic 42 years ago? Ruth's eyes filled with tears. She struggled to speak. Yes, she whispered. A wave of whispers rolled through the crowd. Elijah's heart pounded. What happened? But before Ruth could answer, a loud siren suddenly echoed through the town. A police car pulled up quickly beside the crowd. Officer Raymond stepped out, looking serious. I need everyone to step back, he said. People moved aside nervously. The officer walked toward Marcus first. Mr. Hale, he said firmly, we need to talk. Marcus looked amused. About what? Officer Raymond held up a small evidence bag. Inside it was a silver necklace shaped like a broken heart. The same necklace Marcus had given Ruth earlier. We found this near the church fire, the officer said. The crowd gasped again. Marcus's smile slowly faded. And, Marcus asked calmly. The officer's voice became serious. There are fingerprints on it. He paused before continuing. And they don't belong to you. The entire crowd turned toward Ruth. But the officer shook his head. No, he said. They belong to someone else. He slowly turned and looked directly at Pastor Daniel. And the pastor's face suddenly turned pale with fear. Before the story continues, think about this question. If you discovered a secret that could ruin the reputation of people you respected for years, would you reveal it or protect them? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to see how this mystery unfolds, make sure to like the video. Subscribe to the channel and share this story with someone who enjoys powerful and suspenseful stories. Because the truth behind Red Creek's secret is far from over. The crowd fell into stunned silence as Officer Raymond looked directly at Pastor Daniel. For a long moment, no one moved. The silver necklace inside the evidence bag glinted in the afternoon light, its broken heart shape now carrying far more meaning than anyone had imagined. Pastor Daniel's hands trembled slightly. That cannot be correct, he said weakly. Officer Raymond kept his voice calm but firm. The lab confirmed the fingerprints this morning. Murmurs rippled through the crowd again. Mrs. Johnson covered her mouth in shock. Pastor Daniel, that doesn't make any sense. Elijah looked between the officer and the pastor. Why would the pastor's fingerprints be on that necklace? He asked. Marcus Hale stood nearby with a quiet smile forming again. Oh, this just keeps getting better, he muttered. Ruth stared at the ground, her heart racing. She knew things were unraveling faster than anyone could stop them. Officer Raymond stepped closer to Pastor Daniel. Sir, he said carefully, can you explain why your fingerprints were found on the necklace that Mr. Hale gave to Ruth Walker? Pastor Daniel swallowed hard. His eyes moved across the crowd, the same people he had guided spiritually for years. People who trusted him. People who believed in him. He began. But the words refused to come. Marcus clapped slowly from behind them. Well, Pastor, he said mockingly, looks like it's your turn to speak. Elijah shot Marcus an angry look. This isn't a game. Marcus shrugged. For 42 years, it has been. The crowd grew restless. Just tell us the truth, someone shouted. Yes, another voice added. What is going on? Pastor Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength. When he opened them again, his voice sounded tired. 42 years ago, he began slowly, I was not the pastor yet. The crowd listened carefully. I was a young assistant at the church, he continued, helping with records, community events, and counseling. His gaze moved briefly toward Ruth. And one night, something happened that none of us were prepared for. Elijah's chest tightened. What happened? The pastor hesitated again. But Marcus stepped forward. Oh, I'll help, he said with a grin. That was the night a baby was secretly born in the clinic. Gasps filled the air. Marcus continued. And that baby was supposed to disappear. Ruth shook her head quickly. No. But Marcus kept talking. Yes, he said, because that baby's existence would have destroyed several important lives in this town. Elijah looked confused and angry. What baby? Marcus pointed directly at him. You. The word landed like thunder. The crowd erupted again. That's impossible. Elijah grew up here. We all know his parents. But Marcus raised his voice above the noise. Do you? The murmuring slowly faded. Marcus turned toward Ruth again. Go ahead, he said. Tell them. Ruth's face was pale with fear. I can't. Marcus smiled coldly. Then I will. But before he could speak again, Pastor Daniel raised his voice. Enough. Everyone turned toward him. His voice was stronger now. If this truth must come out, it will come out completely. Marcus folded his arms. By all means. The pastor looked directly at Elijah. You deserve to know the truth, he said quietly. Elijah's heart pounded harder. What truth? Pastor Daniel took a deep breath. The woman listed as your mother in that record. He glanced at Ruth. Was not supposed to raise you. The crowd gasped again. Ruth's tears finally spilled down her cheeks. Elijah, she whispered. But Elijah shook his head. Just say it. Pastor Daniel continued. The baby born that night was part of a terrible mistake. Marcus interrupted with a laugh. Mistake, that's one way to describe it. The pastor ignored him. There was an accident, a fight, and someone got hurt. The crowd leaned closer. Who? Someone asked. Pastor Daniel's voice dropped. Marcus Hale's older brother. Marcus's smile disappeared instantly. The crowd fell silent again. Elijah looked confused. I thought Marcus was an only child. Marcus's jaw tightened. That's what everyone was supposed to believe. The whispers started again. You had a brother, Mrs. Johnson asked. Marcus said nothing. Pastor Daniel continued slowly. Marcus's brother, Samuel Hale, was involved in a confrontation at the clinic that night. Ruth's hands covered her mouth. Stop, she whispered. But the pastor continued. During that fight, Samuel was badly injured. Elijah frowned. What does that have to do with me? Pastor Daniel looked directly into Elijah's eyes. Because you were born during that chaos. The words hung heavily in the air. Elijah, the pastor said quietly, the truth is you were not supposed to survive that night. The crowd gasped again. But Marcus suddenly laughed loudly. Oh, this is rich, he said. Then he looked directly at Elijah. You want the real truth. Elijah glared at him. Marcus's voice became darker. You weren't just born that night. He paused before delivering the shocking words. You were the reason my brother died. The entire crowd exploded into chaos once again. People shouted in disbelief. That can't be true. How could a baby cause someone's death? Elijah stood frozen, trying to understand what he had just heard. But Marcus wasn't finished. He leaned closer and whispered something that only Elijah could hear. And when Elijah heard those words, his entire body went still. Because Marcus had just revealed something far worse than anyone in Red Creek had imagined. Something that meant the secret hidden for 42 years was not just about a birth. It was about a crime. The crowd outside the burned church was louder than ever. People argued, whispered, and tried to understand the impossible story unfolding in front of them. Elijah caused someone's death. That doesn't make any sense. He was a baby. But Elijah barely heard the voices anymore. His mind was stuck on the words Marcus had whispered to him. You weren't just the reason my brother died. You were the reason they buried the truth. Elijah slowly lifted his head and stared at Marcus. What did you mean? He demanded. Marcus smirked slightly. You really don't know, do you? Ruth stepped forward quickly. Marcus, stop. Her voice shook with fear. You've already done enough. But Marcus ignored her. Instead, he looked at the crowd like a man, finally ready to reveal a long-hidden story. You all think Samuel Hale died in an accident, Marcus said. Many people nodded. That had always been the story. Samuel Hale had supposedly died in a farming accident outside town. A tragic but simple explanation. Marcus laughed quietly. That accident never happened. The crowd gasped. Mrs. Johnson shook her head. No, we attended the funeral. Marcus's eyes darkened. You attended a funeral with an empty coffin. The words sent a wave of shock through the crowd. Pastor Daniel stepped forward quickly. Marcus, enough. But Marcus raised his voice. For 42 years, this town has lived a lie. His finger pointed directly at Ruth. And she helped create it. Ruth's tears flowed freely now. Elijah, she whispered. But Elijah's eyes stayed on Marcus. Tell me everything, he said. Marcus took a slow breath. Fine. The entire crowd listened carefully. That night at the clinic, Marcus began, my brother Samuel confronted someone. Who? Elijah asked. Marcus pointed again. Ruth. Gasps echoed again. Ruth shook her head desperately. That's not how it happened. Marcus continued, as if she hadn't spoken. Samuel had discovered something he wasn't supposed to know. The crowd leaned closer. What did he discover? Someone asked. Marcus smiled coldly. He discovered that the baby being born that night, he looked directly at Elijah, was not supposed to exist. Elijah frowned. What does that mean? Marcus's voice became sharper. It means your birth would have destroyed the reputation of several powerful people in this town. People began whispering again. Which people? Marcus turned slowly toward Pastor Daniel. The crowd followed his gaze. The pastor looked exhausted. Elijah, Pastor Daniel said quietly, there is more to this story than Marcus understands. Marcus laughed. Oh, I understand perfectly. He looked back at Elijah. My brother came to that clinic because he wanted to expose the truth. But something went wrong. Elijah's heart pounded. What happened? Marcus's expression hardened. My brother never walked out of that clinic. The crowd froze. Ruth covered her face with her hands. Marcus continued. And instead of telling the truth, these people buried it. He pointed at Ruth. Then at Pastor Daniel. They buried my brother's death and created a fake story about a farm accident. The whispers grew louder. Why would they do that? Someone asked. Marcus answered immediately. Because if the real story came out, the baby would have been taken away. Elijah felt his chest tighten. What baby? Marcus looked directly at him again. You. Elijah shook his head slowly. That still doesn't explain how I caused Samuel's death. Marcus's eyes burned with anger. Because my brother found out who your real father was. The crowd went silent again. Even the wind seemed to stop. Elijah's voice came out slowly. My real father. Marcus nodded. Yes. Ruth cried harder. Elijah, please. But Marcus finished the sentence. Your father was the most respected man in Red Creek at the time. People began looking around nervously. Who? Mrs. Johnson asked. Marcus turned slowly. His finger lifted, and he pointed straight at Pastor Daniel. Gasps erupted louder than ever before. That's impossible. The pastor. He's been a man of faith his whole life. Pastor Daniel lowered his head. I was not the pastor yet back then, he said quietly. Elijah's world seemed to tilt. You're saying he's my father? Marcus nodded. Yes. The crowd buzzed with disbelief. Ruth finally spoke through her tears. Yes, she whispered. It's true. Elijah staggered back a step. Everything he thought he knew about his life suddenly felt like a lie. Marcus folded his arms. My brother found out about their secret relationship, he said. He came to the clinic to confront them. Marcus's voice grew darker. And during the argument, my brother fell. The crowd leaned closer. Fell where? Someone asked. Marcus looked at the ground. Down the clinic stairs. Ruth cried out. It was an accident. But Marcus shook his head. You covered it up. He looked at Elijah again. They said if the town discovered the truth, your life would be ruined. Marcus's voice turned bitter. So they buried my brother and built a lie that lasted 42 years. The crowd was completely silent now. Elijah slowly turned toward Pastor Daniel. Is it true? The pastor's eyes filled with regret. Yes. The single word echoed through the stunned crowd. But Elijah's voice came out one more time. Then why? Why keep this secret for so long? Pastor Daniel looked broken. Because the truth would destroy more lives than it would save. Marcus laughed coldly. Too late for that. But at that moment, Officer Raymond stepped forward again. His expression was serious. There's something else everyone needs to know. The crowd turned toward him. What? Mrs. Johnson asked. The officer held up another evidence bag. Inside, it was a piece of paper pulled from Marcus's truck earlier. We found this inside Marcus Hale's metal box. Marcus's confident expression suddenly changed. The officer unfolded the paper slowly. It's a letter written 30 years ago. Written by Samuel Hale. The crowd gasped again. Officer Raymond looked up. And according to this letter, he paused before finishing the sentence. Samuel Hale knew his fall was an accident. The entire crowd turned toward Marcus. But Marcus's face had suddenly gone pale. Because the letter continued with a sentence no one expected. And he also wrote the name of the person who actually pushed him. The entire town of Red Creek held its breath. No one moved. No one spoke. All eyes were fixed on the piece of paper in Officer Raymond's hand. Marcus Hale stood frozen, his confident smile gone for the first time since the secret began unraveling. Elijah's heart pounded in his chest. What name? He asked slowly. The officer looked down at the letter again, making sure he was reading it correctly. This letter was written by Samuel Hale shortly before he died, Officer Raymond said. He explains that during the argument at the clinic, he lost his balance near the stairway. The crowd leaned closer. But before he fell, the officer continued, someone shoved him. Gasps spread through the people again. Ruth's tears stopped for a moment as she looked up in shock. Marcus shook his head immediately. That's a lie, he said. But his voice didn't sound as confident as before. Elijah's voice cut through the silence. Read the name. Officer Raymond hesitated briefly. Then he read the final line of the letter. The person who pushed Samuel Hale was Marcus Hale. The words exploded through the crowd like thunder. For several seconds, no one reacted. Then the noise came all at once. What? That can't be true. He accused his own brother. Marcus stepped backward. No, he said quickly, that's impossible. But the officer held up the letter again. The handwriting has already been verified, he said firmly. It matches Samuel Hale's records. Marcus's face twisted with anger. My brother would never write something like that. But Pastor Daniel spoke quietly. Unless it was the truth. Marcus turned sharply toward him. You should keep quiet, Marcus snapped. You're not innocent in this story either. The crowd murmured again. Everyone remembered the earlier revelation. That Pastor Daniel was Elijah's real father. That Ruth had hidden Elijah's birth. But now the focus had shifted again. Elijah slowly walked toward Marcus. You said I was the reason your brother died, he said. Marcus glared at him. You were. Elijah shook his head. No. His voice became firmer. You used my birth as an excuse to hide what you did. The officer nodded slightly. We also found something else in Marcus's truck, he said. He held up another document. A newspaper article from 42 years ago. Mrs. Johnson squinted. What does it say? The officer read aloud. It reports that Samuel Hale discovered evidence of illegal land deals connected to the Hale family. Whispers spread again. Illegal deals. What kind? The officer continued. Samuel planned to expose the documents to the town council. Marcus clenched his fists. Stop talking. But the officer ignored him. It appears Samuel came to the clinic that night to confront several people involved in hiding those documents. Elijah frowned. Which people? The officer looked directly at Marcus. The Hale family. The truth slowly settled over the crowd, like a heavy storm cloud. Marcus's brother had discovered corruption. He planned to expose it. And that confrontation had led to the fight at the clinic. Marcus shook his head violently. No, you're twisting the story. But Ruth stepped forward now. Her voice was calmer than before. Marcus, she said softly, I saw what happened that night. Marcus froze. You weren't supposed to see anything, he whispered. Ruth wiped the last tears from her face. You pushed him, she said. Samuel fell down the stairs. The crowd gasped again. Marcus looked around desperately. But the faces staring back at him were no longer fearful. They were angry. You all believed the lie, Marcus shouted. For decades. Yes, Pastor Daniel replied quietly. We believed the lie because we thought it would protect the town. Elijah looked at him. And protect me. The pastor nodded slowly. Yes. Elijah took a deep breath. So you hid the truth about my birth, to keep people from asking questions about that night. Yes, the pastor admitted. And to keep Marcus from destroying everything. Marcus laughed bitterly. You all think exposing this now fixes anything. Officer Raymond stepped forward. It doesn't fix the past, he said. But it does bring justice. He reached for Marcus's arm. Marcus Hale, you are under arrest for the death of Samuel Hale and for falsifying evidence for over 4 decades. Marcus tried to pull away. But 2 officers who had just arrived grabbed him. As they placed the handcuffs on his wrists, Marcus looked directly at Elijah. This town will never look at you the same way again, he said. Elijah met his gaze calmly. Maybe not, he replied. But at least the truth is finally free. Marcus was placed into the police car as the crowd slowly began processing everything they had just learned. 42 years of lies. Secrets buried under fear. And a truth that almost disappeared forever. Ruth stepped toward Elijah carefully. I'm sorry, she whispered. Elijah looked at her. You protected me. She nodded weakly. Yes. Elijah then turned toward Pastor Daniel. His real father. The man who had carried the secret all these years. Why didn't you ever tell me? Elijah asked. The pastor's voice was heavy with regret. Because I was afraid, he said. Afraid you would hate me. Elijah thought about it for a long moment. Then he spoke quietly. I don't hate you. The pastor's eyes filled with relief. But from now on, Elijah added, no more secrets. Pastor Daniel nodded. No more secrets. Around them, the people of Red Creek slowly began returning to their homes, still discussing the shocking truth. For the first time in 42 years, the town was finally facing its past. And although the truth had been painful, it had also set them free. Before this story ends, think about this question. If you discovered a secret that had been hidden for decades, would you reveal it even if it could change everything? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story kept you thinking until the very end, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves powerful stories about truth and justice. And tell us something interesting. Did you ever suspect who was really behind the secret in Red Creek?